So welcome to HiNZ 2017, and we're talking this morning with Dave Snowden. And Dave, I'd like you to talk about the highlights of your presentation yesterday. Particularly, you mentioned stories were very important. You mentioned the tyranny of social medicine, which got our attention social media, my apologies, which got our attention very, very quickly, and then went into your presentation. So share with us the highlights.
Okay, I think there were a few key points I was trying to make. One is a phrase I came up with in Washington 15 years ago, which is anything an algorithm can interpret, an algorithm can create. And several of us forecast back then that social media was going to be a problem, not the solution. And we got it wrong by about 10 years, but with Trump, with Brexit, we can now see what's happening. And one of the big dangers at the moment is a depersonalization of people, reducing people to being a source of data rather than being human beings. And you can see this in a lot of the Internet of Things. Yeah, and the basic naive belief that if you just get all of this data and make it available to everybody, the world will be a wonderful place. It won't be. It will be a world deeply manipulated for political and commercial purposes. Yeah? So one of the things we've been working on is to effectively make people subjects in their own journey back to health or their journey to maintain health, rather than making them objects or data sources. And that's done by capturing their day-to-day anecdotal experience, but critically allowing them to self-interpret that experience into a quantitative framework, so that the material can scale and be used for operational purposes. So for example, some of the work we've done on chronic pulmonary care, we can account for 90% of the variation on oxygen take-up with people with the same physiological condition by the way they index their stories as they go through day-to-day lives. So we've found ways to measure human motivation, human attitude, but then to give people autonomy over that material so they themselves can decide how to change it.
And you also talked about the journey. You know, I think you used the expression the journey to well-being.
Yeah.
Can you go into that a bit more?
Yeah, I think this comes from complexity theory, which is what my centre is based on. Right, in a complex system, which is most human systems, you can't define goals. If you define goals, you get perverse results, and we see this with KPIs, with the classic targeting approach. And by the way, the research says very clearly that if people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. And the area where we most need intrinsic motivation is nursing, and the area where we create the most targets. So in fact, we're even getting the science wrong at that point, right? So the concept of a journey is key, and it's partly based on my own progress. I got a diagnosis of diabetes 2 4 years ago. And I was lucky I knew it could be reversed, and I knew what I had to do for that. So I went on a hero's journey, and I refused to accept it was a palliative issue. I starved myself, because that's how you get the pancreas to reconfigure. But in that journey, I was helped by other people interacting with me, by constant small micro interactions, by discovery, by multiple interactions with the medical profession. And I was lucky because I had a fairly public profile. Most people are given a booklet, sent on a course, and then left to their own devices, and it doesn't work. Yeah, they're left on an unassisted journey. So part of what we're working on is to make those journeys areas where people can provide peer support and where they can discover medical solutions without having them imposed on it, yeah, but on this sort of micro-reinforcement or nudge-type basis. Yeah? I think that also leads into the wider work on behavioural change. And you want to nudge a system when it's ready to be nudged, and that's probably a difference between our approach and most of the behavioural economics. I often say they're yanking, not nudging. They try and do small manipulations to get people to a desired goal. We measure when the system is ready to be nudged, it's on a tipping point, and then we push it. Or critically, we get people to push it for themselves. So on a personal health journey, I've been trying to lose weight for 10 years. The diabetes 2 diagnosis, which I luckily got in the middle of Auschwitz, so it put it into perspective, was a trigger mechanism. Without that trigger mechanism, I would still be unhealthy. Yeah? And that was a point at which everything could change for me, and I was lucky it actually happened. And we want to make that something which will scale better.
So when you talk about the journey, and you put down that because of your work, because of your background, you would be naturally perhaps adapt and go for this journey to well-being. And people who are not naturally doing that in these days will be using the social media. So how do you turn that
The
tool
point
that you
is, it's
said?
actually quite dangerous. If you Google an inquiry about, for example, diabetes, you're going to get some pretty nasty stuff. So what we're actually doing instead, and this is about to launch as a program, it's going to be made available in New Zealand as well, is the idea is you elect through your local practitioner, your doctor, to join the program. You're assessed as pre-diabetic, you've agreed to do something. You have to go public to your friends and relatives that you're going to do it. That's actually quite key.
Okay.
You then have to keep daily diaries of what you're doing. And we also, onto the timelines, record everything you ate and everything you did, which is now quite easy. So you get a constant feedback mechanism. And the basic concept here is you have to drop to 1,000 calories a day from what you need. So if you walk for 10 miles, well, you can eat more. So you get this balancing act. But then what we'll do is we'll pay for people to have a dietitian review their electronic records every week and give them personal advice. And that creates a social obligation to the dietitian. We'll give them a physiotherapist to work with them on the Saturday morning before they do their exercise, because if you're obese, and I lost 35 kilograms, right? I was obese. Wouldn't admit it, but I was. Right? The physiotherapist meant that I didn't get injured when I started walking and riding the bike again. If I'd just gone out cold, I'd have probably been injured, and that would have set me back. And again, I had a personal obligation to him. The podiatrist I was meeting every month, because that's one of the dangers with diabetes, was part of the journey, and she was encouraging me, and I didn't want to let her down either. So that's what we're going to do, is introduce people into the journey process who are there to help or augment what you do. And then what's called an exaptive database. This comes from biology. In dinosaurs, feathers repurpose for flight. They don't evolve for flight. So that would allow you, we can build very large medical databases, which you can search the way you search Google, but you know the data is authenticated and it isn't subject to manipulation by snake oil salesmen, which will actually happen in Google. So it's a constraint-based approach to search.
So when you mention the capturing of this information, the responsibility of the patient, or the one who has the diabetes, are they using an app? Are they using a mobile app? And you mentioned you're launching it in New Zealand. Could you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, we've already got several projects which are run in New Zealand, all right? So the basic thing is you can tell a story, take a picture or record a story. It doesn't matter, because we're not going to have it interpreted by data analytics or interpreted by experts. Once you've got that collection of materials, you can imagine a nurse, for example, can take a picture of a patient, get the patient to tell something to the oral stuff and can write notes. That's a composite. You don't want to force everything into codification and written notes, because that's actually not good, right? And then they self-interpret that data onto a series of geometrical shapes. So for example, one of the things we do on patient journeys is they have a matrix between high empathy of staff, low empathy of staff against tolerable pain, intolerable pain. And they place markers on that to say, this is how I feel at the moment, this is how I think the nurse thinks I feel, this is how I think the doctors think I feel. So we're getting that quantitative data in on a continuous real-time basis. Now that can inform people of where they are on their journey, compare them with other people, link them with other people, link them with other people's stories. So again, that's the micro-encouragement.
And there would have to be some training perhaps, and to engage with the patient
minimal.
To actually use it. Is it
Minimal.
really? It's quite intuitive?
We deployed in Africa with young girls who've been subject to genetic mutilation and rape. They're now acting as ethnographers to people at risk of the same appalling condition, which is far more therapeutic to them than being counselled, and that was minimal training. One of the big programs we did in the States was to get children to be journalists to adults who are obese. And record their stories as investigators and then reflect and analyse on it, and the children's behaviour modified. We didn't deal with the problem directly, we got them to look at the problem so they worked it out for themselves. And I think that's, a lot of medical practice is instrumental. It decides what's good for people. It doesn't place people in a position where they can work out what's good for themselves. So we're trying to use technology to augment that process of putting people in the right place, rather than giving them instructions and giving them prescriptions.
One of the other things that you did that raised quite a few laughs in the audience yesterday, you did an analogy of 9-year-old birthday party. If I recall correctly, it was when you were explaining the complex, the chaotic. Can you just perhaps briefly go through that? We thought it was really well done.
Okay, so there are 3 different types of system that you find in nature: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems, right? So an ordered system is highly constrained, so it's predictable. So we drive on the left-hand side of the road in the UK and New Zealand, we don't drive on the right. An operating theatre has rigidly defined roles and rigidly defined practices. So order is something human beings are good at. The trouble is we take it to excess. So the work I've been doing ethnographically with nurses in the UK says they have to break the rules to provide empathetic care. So we're over-constraining the system and forcing people into rule-breaking behaviour against their better judgment. That tends to produce chaos. Sooner or later the system breaks apart. There's no connections between anything else. Yeah? Chaos used creatively can be used for innovation. If you destroy all connections, novelty emerges, but you don't want it to happen by accident. And then a complex adaptive system is one in which there are so many interacting agents, behaviours, constraints. This is the messy reality of life, that you can only describe the present, you can't predict the future. So it's dispositional, not causal. So the best way I've learned to explain that is to say, how would you manage a party for a bunch of 9-year-old kids? So let's look at how we do it in each of the types of system. If you assume a party is a chaotic system, it means there are no constraints, there are no rules, there's no inhibitions. So the children will go on a personal experience for self-discovery. Your house will probably burn down in the process, but it was socially constructed in the first place. And that's just a letter for academic colleagues of mine. I don't recommend this approach. I've got a friend in California who tried it once, but he's never going to repeat it. You know, the recovery cost is too high. The ordered approach, on the other hand, is practiced by all good management consultants and taught in all good management colleges. You agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives are aligned with the mission statement for education and society to which you belong, and are then clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with eagles thrown over valleys and water dropping into ponds, and posters are placed around the room of the party. You produce Disney playing cards with the company value statement, the party value statement printed on the back, and give them to the kids when they come in. And of course, you produced a project plan for the party. The project plan will have clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. And the senior adult starts the party with a motivational videotape. You don't want the children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And they then show the children how their pocket money is linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. You know, following the highly successful completion of the party, you do an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management and mandate future process improvements. Right? And that's the classical approach to party management. The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much different. We draw a line in the sand known as a boundary constraint. We then look the children in the eye and say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. Sorry about the swear word, but it's necessary. And as an adult, you learn the value of flexible boundaries pretty damn fast, because rigid boundaries break catastrophically. Then we throw in what are called catalytic probes, a football, a videotape, a barbecue, in a hope a pattern of play will form, which is called an attractor. And you can only catalyze attractors, you can't create them. If it's beneficial, you give it resources. If it's non-beneficial, well, that's where you deploy fire hoses or other disruptive techniques. Yeah? So what we actually do is we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And that's the huge promise of complexity theory. Because it says in a complex system, a human system, you can manage boundary conditions, you can manage probes, you can manage addition or reduction of resources, but that's all you can manage. And trying to manage everything else is wasting a resource.
That's really good,
Yeah,
Dave. It's a good analogy, and it really brings it into perspective,
told it a few times over the years.
Have you told it?
I add new victims to it from time to
do
time.
you? It's quite effective. Thank you very much, Dave. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.